This is my 1-bit vacuum tube based low voltage homebrew computer. That's a mouthful. It's the UE1. UE for Usagi Electric and 1 because it's my first ever homebrew computer and it has a 1-bit data bus. Now there's a lot of very strange information to unpack about everything that I just said there, but when I say low voltage, I absolutely mean it. At any given point on either of these two boards, you will only ever find plus 24 volts or minus 12 volts. All of the logic is happening based on 24 volts. All the filaments are powered off of 24 volts by tying them in strings of 4. It's low voltage. And that seems insane and it sounds crazy for me harping on it this much, but we all have this image that vacuum tubes have to work at 100 plus volts. But it turns out that if your current requirements are pretty low, which they can be in a digital computing situation, you don't actually need massive voltage. And these little 6AU6 tubes work an absolute treat at just 24 volts. Now, also, I said it is a 1-bit computer. That means it has a 1-bit data bus, and that seems ludicrous and insane, but this is actually very heavily inspired by something that exists in reality. The Motorola MC14500 is a 1-bit industrial control unit designed by Motorola in the 70s to replace relay ladder logic in industrial situations like turnstiles or traffic light controllers or things like that. However, I did not like that Motorola was using just a pure logic unit in their chip, and so I modified that a little bit to have a proper arithmetic logic unit. This thing can do addition and subtraction. But other than that, it's pretty much almost identical to Motorola's minimal ICU system that they outline in the manual. That means that we have just 1 byte of RAM, and we have 8 bits of an output register, so we can write something to the output register, but we can't actually read it back, so 8 bits of write-only memory. And we also have 7 bits of input, which we get on these toggle switches right up here. Now, the stored program in Motorola's minimal ICU system was coming from a ROM, but, well, we don't have a ROM. Instead, we have this paper tape reader right here. This is something that we built completely from scratch. Everything was machined and built from scratch except for the motor itself, which came out of a very early 1960s slot car. In the previous episode, we had the paper tape spinning around, we had lights blinking and flashing, and it was trying to execute instructions, but it was executing the wrong instructions. And we have this little panel over here, which is kind of like a diag panel. Problem is that this panel is dependent upon this panel over here working, which is our halt panel. And the halt panel was not working when we left off in the last episode. The way it's supposed to work is that you can push this button and it halts it, which stops the paper tape here, but everything else stays powered up. And then you can push this button and it resumes and continues running and executing from the paper tape. And it was just not doing that at all. It was an absolute nightmare, but I think I've started to figure out what's going on with this. So we're going to try and tackle that today. However, even when it was running, it was executing the wrong instructions. And I think we've got a problem with light distribution as well as bit ordering. So there's a lot of stuff to tackle today, and we're just going to take it one by one, starting with the halt PCB here. So let's get started. Let's start with the halt circuit because I think it's going to be pretty paramount to getting troubleshooting going on properly and everything else. Now, on our halt PCB here, it's important to note that the VFD is totally unrelated. It's just showing a couple of flags on it and has nothing to do with the halt. The halt is just these power resistors, these two 2D21 thyrotrons, the relay, and the 2 push buttons. Now, I'm using 2D21 thyrotrons here because thyrotrons are actually able to move quite a lot more current than a normal vacuum tube. And in a normal vacuum tube, the grid's potential in relation to the cathode, whether it's deeply negative or similar, allows more or fewer electrons to flow from cathode to anode. If you have that vacuum tube maxed out completely, moving as many electrons as it can, it's still a pretty low current device. If you need to drive something like a relay or solenoids or punches or anything like that, you're gonna need something with a little more oomph. And this is where thyrotrons come in, because thyrotrons are filled with a gas. When enough electrons start flowing from cathode to anode in a thyrotron, the gas experiences something called Townsend discharge. This causes the gas to essentially ionize, and it creates a stream of plasma that connects the cathode to the anode. And because you have this stream of plasma connecting the anode and cathode, you can move a whole lot more current, and you can drive things like relays pretty easily. However, once that stream of plasma is going, it encapsulates the grid, and you can't actually turn it off unless you cut the actual flow of electrons from external to the vacuum tube. So I'll go over the schematic as I originally designed it, and then we'll take a look at why that's wrong. Starting at the top, we have plus 24 volts coming into the common pin of a push button. The normally closed goes out and goes through our power resistors into our thyrotrons. Now I've got both 2D21s here tied up in parallel. You'll notice that the cathodes are tied together, and then coming out of those cathodes, we go into the relay coil, and this either energizes or de-energizes, making or breaking the connection to our actual motor on the paper tape reader. Now, how do we kick this whole thing off? And I've got it set up pretty much exactly how I set up all of my vacuum tubes. I've got a 220K, 220K voltage divider between whatever the input is and negative 12 volts. And if I push the halt button, we get 24 volts coming through the common into the normally open, goes through the 220K into the grid, and should allow enough electrons to flow that allows the tube to ionize and energize the coil of our relay, which will turn off the electric motor. However, whenever I was pushing that button, that wasn't happening. I could not get the tube to ionize. And it turns out that if I drop the value of those grid resistors from 220K to 33K, now the tube ionizes. And that's very strange. Normally, you would not want any grid current at all. As a matter of fact, if we look at how the Bendix does it, this is the punch schematic for the Bendix, and you can see it uses thyrotrons. They're actually 2D21s, the exact same tube. And if we look at the grid on it, it's using 470K ohm resistors on the grid. So there's not a whole lot of grid current happening in the 2D21s on the Bendix, but they're ionizing just fine. And I think in order to get enough current moving, I have to actually get current flowing through the grid as well, because I'm running at such a tiny voltage, 24 volts. These 2D21s were not meant to do that. So I have to drop that grid resistor way down, and then they actually did start to ionize. So now all we got to do is we've got to modify this board with some 33K ohm resistors off of the push button, plug it back into the machine and see if we've got it working. Got the board back in place. Let's flip the power switch on here and see if it's actually working. Now, I was expecting this to happen. The way I have designed this is that the tape is going to always run until these get warm enough to actually halt. We'll see if they're warm enough. Yeah, there we go. Nice. So if I push this button, that halts it. If I push that button, it resumes it. Halt, resume. Oh, wait, that time it stopped on its own. Does that mean it picked up a halt instruction? There shouldn't be a halt instruction at that point. So I think maybe it's picking up wrong instructions. Let's see if it does it again. Oh, it's inconsistent. That's interesting. But it being inconsistent is not unexpected. We have light problems. I'm pretty sure that we don't have consistent illumination across all of the photodiodes in there. Okay, I've got the scope set up here with one probe on clock and one probe on data. They're slightly offset, as you can see. And this is on bit 3, so this is kind of deep into the middle of the photodiodes and should be getting good light. So if I hit resume here, we'll try to get a single shot of it right quick. There we go, the clock is in yellow and the data is in green. And it's important to note here that the clock is active low. And you can see that the data goes high before the clock drops and stays high for the entire duration of the clock pulse. This is exactly what we want to see. So let's move the probe over from bit 3 to bit 0 and see if it looks any different. All right, we'll go ahead and put the scope back on run. I will hit resume. The tape is going by. Let's see if we can get a nice scope shot here. And immediately I can see a massive problem. You can see that the data in green here does actually get all the way up to a logic high, but it gets there late. Remember, our clock is active low. On the falling edge of the clock here, the data needs to already be stable, and it's not. And I think this is due to poor illumination. And here's why I'm thinking it's an illumination problem. You can see I've got my 2 light bulbs set up right here, and if I go ahead and hit resume, gets moving along and they're nice and bright, but the topmost photodiode is all the way up here, which is kind of not in line with this little light bulb right there. So I think I need to add a 3rd light bulb in here. To do that, I just need to desolder the 2 power wires to the bulbs, then remove 1 machine screw, and the whole thing slides right out easy peasy. First step, let's remove these old 6-volt 3-watt bulbs. I was running them in series for a combined 6-watt at 12 volts. These new bulbs that I'm popping in are 12-volt 5-watt bulbs, and I'll run them in parallel with a 3rd one for a combined 15 watts of light. It is going to be a tight fit though. I may end up having to explore other options, but let's at least see if I can make this combination work first. I'll drill a new hole in the backing plate at the correct spacing, then pull out a new machine screw and cinch the whole thing down tight. It looks like it's just barely going to fit, so let's go ahead and solder these up, tying them together in parallel. One last change I'm going to make is to the roller bearing for the paper tape. I'm actually going to bump up to using 2 bearings, but not for the reason that you may be thinking. Ultimately, I'm going to pop an O-ring into the groove between the 2 bearings, and this will create a nice squishy pressure point against the tape that should effectively eliminate tape slip altogether. And speaking of tape, I think we need a new test routine here. There are specific things I want to check as we bring this thing up, so it's time to fire up the laptop, grab our binary file, and send it to the Facet 4070, which punches it out with apparent ease, although apparent being the operative keyword here. Things have taken a turn. I'm well deep into a tangent here. I need to punch a new tape in order to properly test everything out on the UE1, and I've got one punched here and this looks fantastic. But if you look closer, bit level 6 is not punching correctly. I can see indentations where it tried to punch and it just didn't make it all the way through. And that's an incredibly important bit level because that's part of my opcode. And so I've got the punch in a million pieces here. Let me show you. I've been doing a ton of testing, going over all sorts of different types of patterns. I even tried using a different type of tape. This is a much thinner style tape here, and it still didn't even get through this thin type of tape. And what's really super curious is that if you do all of the punches at once, it'll actually get through. There's a little button on here called code holes, and if I push that, it punches bit level 6 just fine. But, well, you can see here that this is supposed to punch everything of bit level 6, and it's punching it, and not punching it, and punching it, and not punching it. It's a very curious failure. And so I've got the entire punch mechanism out, but I can also get in here and double check the adjustment of everything in here and make sure that that's all moving smoothly. Hopefully I can get this thing going again because I really do need a new tape punched for this thing. I think I've got it going. It was an adjustment thing, and the manual, which is available online and I printed out here, was just absolutely useless. It provided zero help whatsoever. I just had to take the thing apart, kind of understand how it was all put together, and then run it while it was apart and feel the adjustment by hand. And I was able, I think, to get bit level 6 adjusted correctly. It took a ton of test paper here. All of these are useless. It's just garbage now. But I think it's going. I have it adjusted a little slower to 300 baud, but I'll go ahead and hit enter here. And it's punching. And I can already see that bit level 6 is punching like it's supposed to. That's brilliant. And if we rip it off, look at that. Perfectly punched tape. All bit levels are punching exactly like they're supposed to. So this can now be used on that. after we do a bit of rewiring, because we do have some bit ordering problems going on. Whenever I write a program for the UE1, I write it in this format here. You have an opcode on the left, 1, IEN, OEN, NAND, and then you have a memory address on the right, SR0, RR, SR7, SR1, and so on. And each opcode and each memory address can equate to a 4-bit nibble. IEN RR would be 1010, 1000. So this layout I think is pretty standard for writing raw assembly. You have an opcode on one side and then a memory address on the other. And I need to get this assembly language to raw binary because that's what ultimately has to be punched out onto our tape here. And so I just wrote a quick little assembler in Quick Basic. And first of all, thank you, Corey, for helping get me set up in a Quick Basic environment that makes sense and was easy to use. And so you just fire up this Quick Basic assembler, point it at the file to assemble, and it spits out a binary file that looks like this. You can see it's just a collection of raw binary represented here as hexadecimal. But now that I have this raw hexadecimal, all I gotta do is take this file and send it via teraterm to the punch. And if the punch is working correctly, I end up with a tape like this. Now, there is a problem here. Where is my opcode and where is my memory address physically located on this tape? Well, if we take a look at the very top here, our first instruction should be 40. So that would be a 0100 followed again by 4 zeros. And so if we look at the very top here, so the least significant bit is going to be all the way on the right, most significant bit is all the way on the left, and the clock isn't straight down the dead center, it's offset to one side, and it's offset towards the least significant bit side. However, whenever I wired up the harness that goes from the photodiode reader over to the rest of the computer, I think I got it backwards. I think I put the least significant bit where the most significant bit is and the most significant bit where the least significant bit is. Essentially, I confused little endian for big endian, but I think there's also a bigger problem because the way that I actually have it physically wired, not only do I have the endianness swapped, I also have the nibbles in the wrong place. It's a complete and total nightmare. So I think I need to just pull the harness off, unsolder all of the wires from it, and just make a new harness that goes to the right places. Then we can load this tape up and give it actually a real deal proper test. All right, let's get this harness unplugged and over onto the desk. Thankfully, it's dead simple to get out. Then starts the tedious process of desoldering and removing all 8 data wires, and after they're out, I'll go through and clean up the PCBs with some wick, then measure, bend, cut, and solder in new wires going to the correct places. With it all soldered back up, let's plug it back in and give it a test. All right, I've got it back together. It should be mostly warmed up now. I haven't actually tried testing this out. I have no idea if it's gonna work, but there are some VFDs down here, and I'm hoping to see these VFDs change, but I'm not expecting them to because I still haven't done any adjustment up here for all of the photodiodes, and we have new lighting going on. So I'm expecting those to be totally out of adjustment, but in order to adjust those, I had to get it back together and get a tape in it, so I figured might as well bring you guys along for the ride of the first spin through the tape while everything is still unadjusted. So let's hit go. Well, we can see some data showing up here. It doesn't look like we're getting the correct data. Our output register here has not changed. And I can't see anything clocking into the input register. So yeah, we definitely still have a problem. Probably the clock is totally maladjusted, so we're never actually getting a clock. I need to sit down with the scope, readjust these, and then we'll give it another shot. And yeah, look at that. That's the clock track, completely out of whack. A few turns on the potentiometer and it comes right back into shape though, which makes perfect sense as to why. The number of lights and their relative position has changed pretty dramatically, so of course the bias is going to be completely out of whack. Not just for the clock, but for, most likely, all the data lines. So I just gotta get the tape going on an infinite loop and move down the line one by one, checking and adjusting each data line so that it goes high before the clock and stays high for the duration of the clock pulse. With them all adjusted, let's take a look at our instruction register now. Yellow is the clock, and remember it's active low. Green is the data in, and blue is the latched output. You can see it's toggling perfectly now. The instruction register is latching in opcodes exactly like it should be. But it's still not working right. Something is definitely amiss. Thankfully, the halt board is working, so I can halt the tape and use the diag panel to single step through instructions. And it took a bit of tracing and thinking, but I think I've isolated the problem to this PCB here on the processor. I'll unscrew the indicator board and then slide it out of the way, and then I can get the PCB in question out as well. With it on the bench, let's pull out the tubes to make it easier to work on. I'll pull out my wick once again and remove 2 jumpers, as well as remove 2 diodes, and then I'll solder in 2 resistors as bodges to hopefully get us back up and going. So what was wrong? Well, when I built this many moons ago, data in and data out were completely separate. But now that I've tied them together into a singular data bus, I had a situation where a buffer was feeding back into itself, forcing a high value onto the bus that could never be cleared. All right, we're making some progress here. After chasing down a bus conflict problem for like 5 hours, homebrew computing is hard, man. But I think we've got that bus conflict issue squared away. I then did some more hunting and found 2 bad vacuum tubes that were not working well in our memory, and we've made some progress. Let's go ahead and hit run on this. And it runs, does a full lap, finishes on a halt. So halt is working absolutely perfectly. That's the last instruction on this tape. You saw that the output register down here was also doing a lot of blinking. And if we look up at all of the VFDs that represent the individual bits of both the scratch register and the output register, they are also all blinking, which is both good news and bad news. We are trying to essentially fill the scratch register, empty the scratch register, fill the output register, empty the output register. And we're gonna do that like, I don't know, 15 times before we halt. So it's all moving really rapidly, but the patterns don't match. So we are executing the correct instructions. I've verified that. So we are absolutely running code and running the correct code. So we are doing pretty much computing. The only problem is that we're having difficulty getting those values to latch into the correct bits in memory. This could be a problem with how we drive it. This could be a problem with the memory itself. This weird like 6977 6AU6 memory is very finicky and was not a great design choice on my behalf, but we're gonna see if we can get that to work. So we are making wild progress, and that's really exciting. But I'm gonna take a short break for a minute and focus on something else. I know I should be working on more memory troubleshooting, but these open spaces to the sides of the tape box are driving me a little crazy. I need to put something there. So let's fire up the mill and cut out a new PCB. Quite possibly the last PCB to ever be cut for the UE1. I love watching the hilariously oversized Bridgeport daintily slice out electrical traces as it burns through thousands and thousands of lines of G code. The PCB is really starting to take shape, and once it's done and cleaned up, it's time to solder it up. There aren't too many components on this one, just a handful of resistors, 2 thyrotrons, and a relay. Once it's all soldered up and finished, let's measure out where it's going to go. I want it to be perfectly centered in the space to the side of the box. So I'll carefully measure, then drill out the mounting holes, and then thread in the studs that the PCB will mount to. With the PCB in place and after locking it down, it looks amazing. But this is just the left side. Something has to go on the right side as well. So let's go ahead and get that installed next. Well, I think you guys probably figured it out. You asked for it. It needed it. I agree 100%. It's a bell. We got a bell. Now on this paper tape that I have up here, this test routine, the very last instruction is a halt, and that appears to be working correctly. But the instruction right before that is one that I'm calling IOC, or input-output control. It just so happens that I've tied that into our little bell controller board up here. So if this is working correctly, I have absolutely no idea if it is, it should make one loop, ring the bell, then halt. Let's please ring. I want to hear this thing ring. Go. It rang the bell perfectly. One full ting. Let's give that one more go here. That's so good. It's so good. We gotta do it one more time. One more time. That never gets old. It rings the bell. It has a bell. We still have problems with memory down here, but the CPU is executing instructions perfectly regardless of what speed we're running it at. Everything from this point up is working perfectly. It's a computer. It's ringing in the new year with its awesome bell. And in January, we're gonna button it up and call it complete so we can move on to the next iteration of vacuum tube computer. But I think a ringing bell is an excellent way to greet 2025. So I wanna thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you next year. Oh, that's so cool.